Why, Konami? Why? I mean, do you really hate Sparkster that much? And I was excited for this game too, and it was such a disappointment. And all of you know how much I loved Rocket Knight Adventures and how much I praised it, but that was probably the only good game in the series.
I loved Rocket Knight Adventures, and I still do. It's fun, fast-paced, and beautiful looking. The sequel, Sparkster Rocket Knight Adventures 2 for the Genesis, looked like crap, sounded like crap, and played like crap. Gone was the long-range attack, the gameplay was slower, while the only improvement was the auto-charge and multiple boosting. The spin-off and non-canon Sparkster for the Super Nintendo was amazing, and just as good as the first Genesis game, but was incredibly difficult.
After 16 years, they made a sequel for Steam, Xbox Live Arcade, and PlayStation Network. Unfortunately, Sparkster should have just stayed playing Possum.
If the sequel to your game takes so long that it hits double digits in the years between titles, just don't bother. Just cancel it and let the series die. Look at Duke Nukem Forever. When Gearbox Software acquired the Duke Nukem intellectual property, they should have just scrapped what 3D Realms had and just made their own game.
I know that I've brought up Duke Nukem Forever a couple times recently, but I think that game just serves as a perfect example for many topics, especially deadlines.
What I'm saying is that if it takes so long for a sequel to hit the market, you're throwing gasoline onto the tiny flame that the fans still hold for the series. Fond memories are reignited when the game is released, only a few people like it, and most of the fans are left disappointed.
I remember when I saw the trailer, I squealed with joy. I was ecstatic, and the second hit pre-order on Steam, I was there. I had to have this game, and I pre-ordered and I waited, and I was just so disappointed when I got to play the final product.
Graphically and sound-wise, the game looks good. Cartoony graphics and whimsical fantasy-like music are pleasing on the senses. And the music for the first level is a remake of the music from the first stage in the first game, which is very nice to hear. The default keyboard controls are terrible. There's just no comfortable way to use the keyboard. So you need to have a controller to play because there's no way to change the keyboard layout.
If you have to have your hand, like this or like this to play the game, you're gonna have a bad time. It makes me wonder if someone at Konami has mutant flipper hands. Because how could anyone look at that keyboard layout and go, yeah, that looks good.
But the controller is no better. It's really sensitive when it wants to be, almost like it doesn't know its own threshold. And this is only apparent when using the rocket boost. If you go to use the boost while holding the direction slightly up or down, you may or may not go in that direction, and it'll happen at the most inconvenient of times. Sparkster also feels pretty rigid when controlling him. It doesn't feel like there's a natural flow. The previous cartridge titles didn't feel this stiff.
And that's just the first leg of this milk stool. There's two other legs that make this game a disappointment.
The level design is pretty copy and paste. There's an outside stage, an inside stage, a boss stage, and there's a flying stage sprinkled somewhere in between them. Each stage feels exactly the same with just different paint jobs. And that's one thing that just irritates me when developers make a video game. If you copy and paste your levels, that's just lazy. However, I really don't stand by that when talking about this game's levels. Because the levels are different enough, they just follow a very strict formula. And it's obvious that the levels are following this formula.
The enemy AI is cheap, and I mean cheap. If you're able to see in the future, that's still not going to help you.
Some enemies take one hit with your sword, but if you use the long-range attack, it takes multiple hits for some enemies. The first boss is cheap. Its saw blade arm moves incredibly fast, and that's what it'll mainly hit you with, and it gives you almost no chance to avoid it. But the second, third, and final bosses are easy to the point of insulting. The second half of the game has you fighting the pigs, and they take multiple hits with your sword, and a lot of them have shields, while they shoot bombs, lasers, or rockets. And you can't get past their shields. Even when they put the shield down, they still block your attack. The game goes from defeating what's in your way to avoiding everything that you can and only fighting when you need to progress.
And this is when you notice how slow Sparkster is. You're going to be taking so much damage that Sparkster is going to become a redneck Thanksgiving dinner in a matter of no time.
Before anyone jumps on the bandwagon of my complaining about difficulty, I'm not complaining. I'm criticizing that this game is difficult for the wrong reasons. Instead of a gradual incline of difficulty, it's slamming you into massive vertical walls. And another thing, and this is consistent with 2D platform games that come out nowadays, So it's not a point against Rocket Knight, but 2D platform games in general. Why does the camera have to zoom out so far at certain points? I understand that the developers are doing it to display the path, or they're just saying, hey, look how pretty it is. But it adds to the difficulty because now you can't see your character, what you can jump on, your enemies, or their projectiles that well. If you're going to zoom out, give us the option to zoom back in.
And the story's pretty ham-fisted as well. It's more of an excuse to say, hey, this existed at some point, remember?
At the end of Rocket Knight Adventures 2, the Pig Empire comes to the land, apologizes, and offers to share their technology. Sparkster doesn't trust them, but he's blown off by the king, so he leaves the land. 15 years later, the wolves invade, Sparkster dons his armor and heads back. Finding that the pigs are fighting alongside the possums and his nemesis Axel Gear has become his replacement. Sparkster investigates the situation, defeats the Wolf King, but is betrayed by the pigs, who then turn on the possums and enslave them. Sparkster then defeats the pigs and flies home afterwards. It's pretty basic, but I really think Konami could have put more effort into this game. Well, I actually can't say that, as Konami only published this game. Climax Studios developed Rocket Knight. I think that Konami, and other game companies in general, need to stop outsourcing their intellectual property and start making their games in-house again. But that's a rant for another day.
As it stands, Rocket Knight, for me anyway, was a tolerable experience. It just does not feel like its predecessors, and it's just overall disappointing. It is playable, but it just doesn't really feel like it's that much fun.